The first keynote speech of NetEvents Global Press and Analyst Summit of 2018 was delivered by a man who's invested in some of the most iconic companies to come out of Silicon Valley. The keynote speaker was none other than Professor David Cheriton of Stanford University. Take it away, David.
So my actual title is Smart, Lucky, or Prepared, and I just want to talk a little bit about my investment history and thinking, and hopefully we can tease some interesting lessons out of this. Often I think there's a saying on Wall Street, I'd rather be lucky than smart, and I think I have been pretty lucky along the way. Right now, one of the roles I play is I'm involved in a company called Apstra. I'm chief scientist there. I'm a co-founder of the company. I am the investor. There's no outside investment at this point. And so you might ask, why am I doing another startup? And why am I not a venture capitalist? I claim I'm not a venture capitalist. And then how did I get in a position to fund companies myself like this? Like, hey, university professors don't normally do this. So let me try and tackle some of these questions here. So why Apstra? Well, I think Apstra is a good example of how I approach investing and startups. And some people say a startup's a lot of fun. Well, it's kind of, to me, it's like one of the scariest roller coaster rides and you can go on where it's a lot of fun, but it's pretty scary at times. So I look for more than one reason to do things, especially now when I still have my academic inclinations.
Cheriton went on to explain why he chose Apstra to invest in. In particular, he cited major trends towards increased automation and growing fragmentation of the network switch market.
I looked at this and said, I couldn't live with myself in the nursing home if I didn't try to make a company in this space. So it really was an opportunity too good to pass up on. So I don't consider myself a venture capitalist, even though I fund ventures with capital. So at least the people who are really venture capitalists are looking for a variety of investment opportunities, and they're trying to maximize return with a given fund they're working with.
He went on to explain his investment strategy, which focused on those companies that needed not just cash, but also a guiding hand.
So how can I afford to fund these companies? Well, I think I've been very fortunate. I came to Stanford in 1981 as an assistant professor, and it was a crazy place at that time, and I encountered this student there, Andy Bechtolsheim, who was doing this cool stuff, building what was then the Sun workstation, he was doing neat stuff, so I started working with him and developed some software for his hardware and found a hardware bug and so on.
Cheriton talked briefly about his time at Cisco, and then he shared a quick anecdote of just how he met Google's Sergey Brin.
So back at Stanford, I met this guy, a PhD student, Sergey Brin, because we were both rollerblading, and he was rollerblading, I was rollerblading inside the computer science building. And so we knew each other only as fellow rollerbladers, but at one point they came to me for advice about their search technology, and what they wanted to do was license it. And so I helped them and pointed them at an IP lawyer I knew in the Valley and so on.
He talked about how he helped Brin raise money to start Google, and then went on to discuss his relationship with VMware.
VMware is another thing where I was an early investor in VMware, and again, I sort of label this as virtual machines rise again, because this wasn't the first instance of somebody developing virtual machines. So I was involved in hiring Mendel Rosenblum, one of the founders of VMware at Stanford, and sometimes I pick good people, and Mendel was a good pick for a faculty member. I got to know his wife, Diane, because both of us windsurfed, and she's better than I am. And it was kind of curious. I'm glad that I stayed friends with Mendel, because he and I'd take off with his wife off on the San Francisco Bay, and he was kind of left behind. But at any rate, so we got to know each other.
He went on to talk about virtualization and how he was an early investor at VMware, and how he helped found Arista.
So the David, our smallest networking company in the world, took on Cisco, the Goliath, in the cloud data center, and while they were off buying things like flip cameras and so on, we were aimed at the area that was growing the most rapidly with the highest margins, and also benefited from the fact that Cisco had put a very high premium on 10 gigabit Ethernet to protect the lower speed products in their line, whereas we didn't have any lower speed products, so they kind of created what Andy likes to call a price umbrella over us so we could come in here, and they had difficulty competing. When I got out of Arista, I was planning to go back to academia, and this Apstra opportunity came along, and it was essentially yet another network automation company, because people had tried to do this sort of network automation before. And you know, one of the things I find fascinating about networking is it's down in the plumbing, and it's simple enough in its basic principle to explain to your parents, but it's surprisingly complicated when you actually look at all the bells and whistles and features and all the things that people do, plus the complex dynamics that take place there.
He then talked about how the public cloud, such as Amazon's web services, can end up locking you in.
My view here is that we've ended up in a bit of a, what I'll call, medieval computing landscape, because you have Jeff Bezos, who's built this walled garden, if you like, called AWS, which is a castle, and he basically says, come under my protection and you will be safe. And you know, exactly what happened in medieval days. You know, you think the king felt that the highwaymen were a problem. They weren't a problem. They were part of his overall plan, right? You build this castle, the peasants are beholding to you because you protect them from the highwaymen. So we're ending up in this same thing. Now, AWS, if I can mean to this, is sold as the public cloud. Well, you know, what does public mean? It means that if you pay for it, you can use it. Well, by that definition, I claim Disneyland is a public park, because you can pay and you can go in and use it, right? So public cloud is a complete misnomer. And then AWS says, well, that's not the only piece. We don't just provide computing service, we provide thousands of services. And one of the AWS events, they had mentioned some ridiculous number of new services they're adding every day. Well, what people are learning is those services are there for lock-in. They're not all that useful. And there's this disease you get under junior software engineers that say, gee, I've never used something like that. Why don't I try using it with this application that somebody's paying me to develop? And you find these startups and big companies end up where they develop some application and it's using 100 of Jeff Bezos' little services that are unique to AWS.
Cheriton then talked about how companies end up paying huge amounts to Amazon without meaning to do so. But he said there is an alternative.
I view that there's an alternative, which is the private cloud. You can get the same efficiencies as Jeff Bezos, more or less, buying your own hardware, except for how you operate it. And so what separates the efficiency of your operations from AWS is purely automation. So part of my enthusiasm is providing this automation that people have developed, you know, a lot of smart PhDs have developed in places like Amazon and Google, and I know a lot of these people, Facebook and so on, and providing it to other companies. And I think that we're in this very exciting time of what I'll call pervasive automation, which you might consider the third wave of computing, where the first wave was human productivity. You say, well, you know, remember the productivity line of Office Suite and so on. You take people doing stuff, you're going to write a letter. How do you make it more efficient than having to redraft it when there's a spelling mistake? Well, you use Word and so on. And then the second wave was human connectivity. Remember when, you know, Ma Bell was the only way to communicate in real time, and now the internet's created an enormous number of alternatives. I was going to call the third wave human automation, but somehow it didn't sound quite right. But I think the third wave is this automation of things we normally associate with human beings having to do. So when you look at Uber and Waymo and so on, they're automating transportation. And it's not just those companies, it goes beyond that. Like you have Caterpillar Tractor developing, self-driving bulldozers. Airbnb is automating hospitality. Katera is another company I'm involved in, which is automating big parts of construction and supply chain. Casper is another one that's automating smart apartments. And of course, Apstra, which I'm heavily involved in, is automating the data center management. So I think we're seeing this whole trend to automating a whole bunch of things. Automations, none of this is easy, but it's incredibly valuable to do this.
In the final section of his keynote, Cheriton talked about how lucky he had been and finished with summarizing his approach to investing.
I think, this is perhaps a little bit of personal philosophy, but I think I never invest in something that doesn't add real value that I can identify. And, I've missed out on a lot of great investments because of this thinking. So take it with a grain of salt. Never invest in a startup that only exists for one reason, because I've seen so many cases where the one reason goes away. So you want multiple reasons, and to me, 3 is the first large number, so there should be 3 good reasons. And never invest in anything you can't explain to your mother, which may be duplicating the add real value thing. I have people that come to me with ideas for companies, and I can't figure out how you'd ever explain it to a non-technical person. And of course, that's who you're going to sell to in many cases. And also, there's this whole notion of first mover advantage, like you got to come up with something totally new and so on. And in fact, what I've seen is a lot of the first movers are often the first losers. And you can go through the list. Arista was not the first switch company. Google was not the first search engine company. In fact, I had a student involved in a previous switch or search company much earlier and things. So there's a lot of lessons you can learn from the people that go out there and fight on the front lines the first time around here, and they often prepare the market and so on. So I think a lot of success really ties back to I often say that the success of a company is similar to the French Revolution, that it's all about execution. And so the important thing is how well you execute, and some of that goes both ways, what you kill off and what you keep, and how you go about doing it. And finally, it's important to be lucky and be prepared, and obviously choose your friends well, since I've benefited enormously from the friends that I've developed over the years in Silicon Valley. So let me stop there.
And with that, after a short interview with analyst Jerry Caron of Global Data, the session drew to a close.